Welcome back to the Dark Stories. Tonight, we delve into a chilling case that exposes the fragility of safety and the devastating consequences of domestic violence. This is the story of Mackenzie Anderson, a vibrant 21-year-old mother whose life was brutally cut short in a crime that has left a community heartbroken and questioning the very systems meant to protect the vulnerable. Mackenzie was a young woman full of life, a loving mother with a future ahead of her. But that future was stolen in a horrific act of violence, a stark reminder of the insidious nature of domestic abuse and the fear it instills in its victims. The man responsible for shattering Mackenzie's life was her ex-boyfriend, Tyrone Thompson. Their relationship, like so many touched by the darkness of domestic violence, was marred by abuse. Mackenzie had bravely tried to break free, seeking the protection of the law through an Apprehended Violence Order, or AVO. This legal instrument, meant to establish boundaries and ensure safety, became a tragically thin shield against a determined aggressor. Despite the AVO, Mackenzie lived in constant fear, a fear that chillingly foreshadowed the horrific events to come. Her mother, Tabitha Ackret, would later reveal the agonizing reality of her daughter's final weeks, a period shrouded in the dread of Thompson's impending release on parole. Just 16 days after walking free, Thompson would prove Mackenzie's fears tragically well-founded. The night of March 25th, 2022, became Mackenzie's last. In the sanctuary of her own Newcastle apartment, a place where she should have felt safe, her worst nightmare materialized. Tyrone Thompson broke in, his presence shattering the fragile peace she had tried to build. In a frenzied, brutal attack that lasted approximately 2 agonizing minutes, Thompson unleashed a torrent of violence. He armed himself with 2 kitchen knives, weapons readily available, turning a place of nourishment into a scene of unimaginable horror. The details that emerged later painted a picture of sheer brutality. Thompson stabbed Mackenzie an unbelievable 78 times. The force of his rage was so immense that one of the knives he wielded broke during the assault. The sheer number of wounds speaks to a level of rage and intent that is difficult to comprehend. This was not a moment of impulsive anger. It was a sustained and savage act of destruction. The life was violently extinguished from a young woman who had dared to seek safety from her abuser. In the aftermath of this horrific crime, the legal process began. Tyrone Thompson eventually pleaded guilty to Mackenzie's murder in April of 2025, a move that came shortly before his trial was set to commence. This admission of guilt brought a semblance of closure to the legal proceedings, but it did little to soothe the profound grief of Mackenzie's family. The sentencing hearing would reveal the complexities that often plague cases of domestic violence. Justice Richard Weinstein acknowledged the undeniable brutality of Thompson's actions, the history of violence that preceded this final act, Mackenzie's palpable fear, and her desperate attempts to end the relationship. These were all factors that underscored the gravity of the crime. However, the court also considered elements that offered a different perspective, though one that sparked considerable controversy. Thompson's defense presented a history of significant mental health issues, including complex post-traumatic stress disorder and a severe personality disorder. His early life was depicted as one marred by domestic violence and exposure to drugs, factors that Justice Weinstein suggested might have diminished his moral culpability. Ultimately, Tyrone Thompson was sentenced to a maximum of 22 years and 6 months in jail, with a non-parole period of 15 years and 6 months. For Mackenzie's family, this sentence felt like a profound betrayal. Mackenzie's mother, Tabitha Ackret, did not hold back her outrage. Her emotional response resonated with many who saw the sentence as insufficient justice for such a brutal crime. She described the outcome as an insult to women globally, a damning indictment of a system that, in her eyes, had failed to protect her daughter and now undervalued her life. "We are disgusted that this sentence is what they think the value of my daughter's life was worth," she stated, her words echoing the pain and anger of a mother who had lost her child to senseless violence. Tabitha Ackret placed significant blame squarely on the justice system, a system that Mackenzie had turned to for help, but which ultimately could not prevent her tragic fate. She has since called for an urgent appeal of the sentence, her fight for justice far from over. Mackenzie Anderson's story throws a harsh light on the ongoing struggle to protect victims of domestic violence. Here was a young woman who recognized the danger she was in, who sought legal protection, and yet still became the victim of a horrific crime committed by the very person the AVO was meant to keep away. It raises critical questions about the effectiveness of current measures and the support available to those living in fear. According to her mother, the signs of domestic violence were tragically clear in Mackenzie's case. She lived in constant fear, convinced that Thompson would make good on his threats after his release. Mackenzie had already experienced violence at his hands, but had, out of shame, tried to shield her mother from the full extent of the abuse. The AVO was a testament to her efforts to protect herself, a legal barrier that ultimately proved insufficient. For those who find themselves in similar situations, it's crucial to know that help is available. Domestic violence lawyers can provide invaluable assistance, offering legal avenues such as restraining orders, guidance on child custody arrangements, and support in achieving financial independence. All vital steps in breaking free from an abusive relationship. Beyond the legal realm, a strong support network is essential. Domestic violence hotlines, support groups, and counseling services specializing in trauma recovery can offer a lifeline to those who feel isolated and afraid. Reaching out is the first and often the most difficult step towards safety and healing. The tragic story of Mackenzie Anderson serves as a stark reminder of the lethal potential of domestic violence and the urgent need for systemic change. It underscores the importance of believing victims, strengthening protective measures, and holding perpetrators accountable. Mackenzie's life was precious, and her death should not be in vain. Her story must fuel our collective efforts to create a world where everyone feels safe in their own home. Thank you for joining us on The Dark Stories. If you or someone you know is experiencing domestic violence, please reach out for help. You are not alone. Resources and support are available.
Okay, so today we're doing a deep dive into a really tough case. Mackenzie Anderson, 21 years old.
And the headline fact is just brutal. 78 stab wounds.
78. It's a number that's hard to even process. Inflicted by her ex-boyfriend, Tyrone Thompson.
Yeah. And we're going to try and unpack this, look at the whole picture, not just the crime itself.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We want to understand the complexities here. We're drawing on quite a few sources, news reports from places like One News, Newcastle Weekly, People.com.
Inkle, which I think is Pedestrian TV, AAP News, Honey Soy, that's a student paper, right?
Yeah, Sydney Uni. And there's a TikTok from the Daily Telegraph showing the mother's reaction, plus an article from Lawyer Monthly about domestic violence law.
So a mix of news, commentary, and some legal context.
Right. And the mission, I guess, is to look at everything, what led up to this horrific event, the court case, the family's perspective, and what it tells us maybe about domestic violence and the justice system's response.
Okay, so let's start with the crime itself. March 2022 in Mackenzie's apartment in Mayfield.
And it was described as a frenzied attack. You mentioned 78 wounds. They used 2 knives.
2 knives, and the report said one actually snapped. That gives you an idea of the sheer force involved.
And the timing here is critical, isn't it?
Absolutely critical. This happened just 16 days. 16 days after Thompson was released on parole.
And paroles for what?
For previous domestic violence offenses against Mackenzie.
Right. So he gets out, and just over 2 weeks later, this happens. And there's a protection order.
Yep. An apprehended domestic violence order, an AVO, was active at the time, supposed to keep him away.
Which clearly didn't work. You hear about Mackenzie's fear. Her mother, Tabitha Akred, said Mackenzie was totally convinced Thompson would kill her when he got out.
Just imagine living with that level of fear, knowing he's out, knowing his history.
And Mackenzie was trying to get help, right?
Right.
Seeking support from DV groups.
Yeah, she was asking for help with security, stronger doors, cameras, that sort of thing.
And the detail about one agency responding after her death, saying her case was closed because she died. That's just...
It's chilling. It really speaks to maybe a system that's overwhelmed or not proactive enough in high-risk situations.
It feels reactive, doesn't it? Instead of preventative.
Exactly. The support was sought, the fear was expressed, the history was known, the AVO was in place. Yet here we are.
And the scene itself, her friend arrived.
Yeah, a friend came to help, looked through a blocked doorway, and saw Thompson standing over her, stabbing her. Repeatedly.
Just horrific. And Thompson's initial story was, what, self-defense?
Uh-huh. He initially claimed there was a struggle, that Mackenzie came at him with a knife, something like that.
But that didn't hold up.
No. Eventually, right before the trial was supposed to start, April 2025, he pleaded guilty to murder.
Okay, so guilty plea to murder. But there were other factors considered, weren't there? Mental health issues.
Yes, that's a significant part of this. The reports mentioned diagnoses like complex PTSD, severe personality disorder.
And possibly schizoaffective disorder, though not psychotic at the time.
Right. And the judge, Justice Weinstein, explicitly acknowledged these. He considered them as potentially diminishing Thompson's moral culpability.
Okay, so diminished moral culpability, that's a legal concept, meaning what exactly? Less responsible.
It suggests his mental state might mean he couldn't be held fully responsible in the same way someone without those conditions might be. It doesn't excuse the act, but it can influence sentencing.
And that leads us to the sentence itself. What did he get?
22 years and 6 months in jail, with a non-parole period of 15 years and 6 months.
15 and a half years before he's eligible for parole.
Correct. And interestingly, Justice Weinstein, despite considering the mental health factors, stated he believed Thompson intended to kill Mackenzie right from the start of the attack.
So the intent was seen as clear, regardless of the culpability discussion.
That seems to be the judge's finding, yes. Thompson actually watched the sentencing via video link from prison. He wasn't in the courtroom.
And did Thompson himself say anything? Like express remorse?
There was a letter of remorse mentioned in the reports. In it, he apparently said he sort of lost control after his hand got cut during that alleged struggle with Mackenzie over the knife.
Still sticking to that struggle narrative then, even after pleading guilty.
It seems so, based on the reports of the letter, which you can imagine didn't sit well with Mackenzie's family.
No kidding. Let's talk about her mother, Tabitha Akred. Her reaction was incredibly strong.
Understandably so.
Yeah.
The reports are filled with her quotes. She called the sentence an insult to women globally.
An insult to women globally. Wow. And she wanted an immediate appeal.
Yes, called for an urgent appeal. She said the family was, quote, disgusted by what the court decided her daughter's life was worth.
You could just feel the anger and the grief. She put blame on the system too, didn't she?
Absolutely. She explicitly said she placed a great deal of blame for my daughter's death on the justice system, believed it fundamentally failed Mackenzie.
And her victim impact statement must have been harrowing.
Describing Mackenzie's constant fear, her own anguish, it paints a picture of just relentless terror.
And that detail, I can't get it out of my head. The knives used.
Mackenzie bought them for him as a Christmas gift in 2021.
It adds another layer of awful irony to the whole thing, how something seemingly normal becomes part of the horror.
It really underlines the insidious way domestic violence can twist things.
So, looking beyond this specific case, what does it tell us about the bigger picture? We mentioned those articles, Lawyer Monthly and Honey Soit.
Right. The Lawyer Monthly piece gives context on what domestic violence lawyers do, providing legal help, getting restraining orders, navigating custody battles, essential support.
But Mackenzie had an order. A legal protection.
Exactly. And that's where the Honey Soit article really hits home. It questions how these tragedies keep happening even when victims do engage with the system, even when orders are in place.
So awareness isn't the whole solution.
That's the argument. Awareness is crucial, yes, but the article suggests it's not enough without effective legal reform and a justice system that can actually enforce protections and intervene meaningfully. Prevention, not just reaction.
The Honisoy piece also mentioned broader statistics, right?
Yeah.
About violence prevalence.
Yeah, it cited the National Student Safety Survey, showing high rates of sexual assault and violence generally, just reinforcing that Mackenzie's case, while uniquely horrific, exists within a much wider context of violence.
Which brings us back to that complex issue of diminished moral culpability in mental health and sentencing.
It's a huge debate, isn't it? How do you weigh diagnosed mental health issues against the brutality of a crime like this, especially given the history of abuse and the violation of an AVO?
It's a balancing act that courts grapple with all the time. But in cases like this, the outcome often feels, well, unsatisfying to many, especially the victim's loved ones.
It raises fundamental questions about accountability, justice, and how society views the intersection of mental health and violent crime, particularly domestic violence.
And how did the wider community react? You mentioned that TikTok post.
Yeah, the Daily Telegraph posted a clip of Tabitha Akrit speaking outside court, the comments section. Well, it's pretty much what you'd expect.
Anger, disappointment.
But lots of it. Anger at the sentence, frustration with the justice system, huge sympathy for Mackenzie and her mother, lots of calls for reform, for tougher sentences for domestic violence.
So a real sense that justice wasn't fully served here, in the public eye at least.
Definitely a strong sentiment that the outcome didn't match the severity of the crime or the loss. It taps into that broader feeling that maybe the system isn't quite getting it right when it comes to protecting victims and holding perpetrators truly accountable.
And you see calls for reviewing sentencing guidelines, making AVOs more effective, better support. It all comes up.
Yeah, the practical enforcement of those orders is a huge question mark.
So wrapping this up, Mackenzie Anderson's death is just an undeniable tragedy. The details are horrifying, and the impact on her family, particularly her mother, is profound.
It really is. And this deep dive, I think, leaves us with some pretty heavy questions.
Like, how well does our legal system actually protect people in domestic violence situations? When you have an AVO, a known history, expressed fear, and this still happens.
And what systemic changes are really needed? Is it about resources, laws, enforcement, parole conditions? Likely a mix of everything.
It forces you, the listener, to think about that balance.
Right.
Justice for the victim versus considering the perpetrator's circumstances, like mental health. Where does that line sit?
Especially in domestic violence cases, it's an ongoing, difficult debate with no easy answers. This case just brings it into really sharp, tragic focus.
And before we finish, it's crucial to remind everyone listening. If you or someone you know is experiencing domestic or family violence, help is available.
Please reach out. You can call 1-800-RESPECT. That's 1-800-737-732. There's also Lifeline on 131114.
And Beyond Blue on 1-300-224636. These services are there to support you. You don't have to face it alone.